Imagine coming home after a normal day, only to step into a nightmare. This story is the real experience of a real person. By the end of this video, you will be left thinking about the terrifying things happening in our world. For one 24-year-old boy, September 27, 2014 started out like any other day. He had spent the night at a friend's house, laughing, watching movies, living life like any other youth. He had no idea that by the time he returned home, his entire world would be gone. When he stepped through the front door, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The silence was suffocating. He called out for his family, but no one answered. The house was too still, too quiet. Something wasn't right. Then he saw them. 5 bodies, his parents, his 3 younger siblings, all lying side by side as if they had just fallen asleep. But something was horribly wrong. His breath caught in his throat. His hands started shaking. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He reached for his phone and dialed 911. His voice was frantic. His words barely made sense. But one thing was clear. His entire family was dead. Within minutes, police arrived at the home. They had no idea they were about to step into one of the most disturbing mysteries Utah had ever seen. As officers moved through the house, they found no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no blood, just a family lying together in silence. And then they found something strange. A notebook sitting on a table, a checklist, as if someone had been preparing for a trip. Feed the pets. Find someone to watch after the house. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. No note suggests that they took their own lives. No explanation, no warning signs, nothing to say why 2 parents and 3 of their children were now gone. But as investigators searched for answers, they uncovered something far darker than anyone expected. Just before we go into the details of this story, I need you to understand that we have put a lot of work into researching, scripting, and editing this video for your consumption. And the only gift we need from you in return is your subscription to this channel. If you've already done that, thank you very much. You are the reason why we still work very hard on this channel. Now, let's get cracking. 5 bodies, no struggle, no sign of forced entry, no note, nothing to explain why an entire family was gone. Investigators searched the home looking for answers, but the more they looked, the less sense it made. There were no gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no visible injuries at all. The bodies were found lying peacefully side by side, as if they had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Detectives considered the possibility of foul play, but there was no sign of an intruder. Nothing was stolen. The house was untouched. And then a disturbing theory started to take shape. Was this a murder-suicide? But if that was the case, why? The Stracks had no history of violence, no reports of domestic abuse, no known mental health issues. By all accounts, they were a loving family, close to their children, involved in their community. Family and friends were in disbelief. There were no warning signs, no strange behavior, no indication that something like this could happen. Investigators knew they needed more information. If there was no physical evidence, they would have to look inside the bodies themselves. toxicology tests were ordered, and when the results came back, they revealed something disturbing. Investigators had no answers, no signs of struggle, no visible injuries, no clear cause of death. But when the toxicology reports came back, everything changed. Tests confirmed that all 5 family members had died from a lethal mix of drugs. The results forced detectives to face a horrifying reality. Authorities ruled that Benjamin and Christy Strack took their own lives, but their children had no choice. Zion, age 11, and Benson, age 14, were too young to consent. Their deaths were classified as homicides. Then there was the oldest child, Peyton, age 18. His cause of death remained undetermined. Did he take the drugs willingly? Did he know what was happening? Or was he just another victim? One thing was certain: there were no signs of force, no struggle, no restraint marks, no evidence that the children had been physically coerced into taking the drugs. So why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they try to escape? Investigators weren't just dealing with a crime. They were dealing with a belief, a plan, a decision that had been made long before that final night. And when they uncovered the truth behind that decision, it was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The toxicology reports had answered how the Strack family died, but they didn't explain why. Investigators searched for a motive, and when they started digging into Benjamin and Christy Strack's beliefs, they uncovered something disturbing. Friends and family came forward with shocking claims. Benjamin and Christy were convinced that the world was coming to an end. They believed society was collapsing, that evil had taken over, that the only way to escape what was coming was to leave this world behind. To those around them, their fears seemed extreme, but not dangerous. People assumed they wanted to live off the grid, to isolate themselves from what they saw as a broken world. No one imagined they would take their beliefs this far. But investigators discovered something else, something even more alarming. Christy Strack had been in contact with a convicted murderer, Dan Lafferty. Lafferty had been in prison since 1984, serving a life sentence for one of the most infamous crimes in Utah's history: the brutal murders of his sister-in-law and her infant daughter. But it wasn't just murder, it was something worse. Lafferty claimed that he had received a revelation from God, ordering him to kill. It was a crime fueled by religious fanaticism, a belief that death was justified in the name of prophecy. And Christy Strack, she idolized him. Investigators found letters between Christy and Lafferty, private messages, deep conversations, evidence that she wasn't just a follower, she was a disciple. She and Benjamin had even visited him in prison, absorbing his words, his teachings, his twisted view of the world. And the deeper police looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a case of paranoia. This was something planned, something they had prepared for. And it was all leading to one final terrifying decision. As investigators uncovered more about Benjamin and Christy Strack, one thing became clear. This wasn't a sudden decision. This had been building for years. The Stracks had slowly cut themselves off from the world. Friends saw them less. Family visits became rare. They stopped attending social gatherings. And then they pulled their children out of school. They told people they wanted to homeschool, that they wanted to raise their kids away from outside influences. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Christy, in particular, had grown paranoid. She spoke about the government watching them, about dark forces controlling the world, about a future where they wouldn't be safe. She and Benjamin talked about leaving society behind, starting over, going off the grid. To their friends and family, it just sounded like another survivalist fantasy. People assumed they were planning a big move, maybe to a cabin in the woods, a remote homestead somewhere far away. But no one realized their idea of escaping wasn't about finding a new life. It was about leaving this world entirely. By the time investigators pieced everything together, one thing was certain. This was not a spontaneous act. This was planned. Authorities believe Benjamin and Christy Strack had been preparing for this moment for weeks, maybe even months. The to-do list found at the scene was the clearest sign. It wasn't the list of people who were leaving for a trip. It was a checklist of final preparations. Feed the pets. Find someone to watch after the house. As if they expected to be gone. But the most disturbing part, there were no signs of a struggle. Toxicology reports suggested that the children were sedated before they were given the lethal doses. The investigators found no evidence that they were forced, no restraints, no signs of panic. Which raised the most haunting question of all. Did they know? Did they understand what was happening? Or did they simply trust their parents? The way they were found, lying peacefully side by side, suggested that the children never had a reason to be afraid. To Benjamin and Christy Strack, this wasn't murder. This wasn't a tragedy. This was an escape. A way out of a world they believed was too dark, too evil, too broken to survive. And in their minds, they weren't just saving themselves. They were saving their children. One boy survived, one son left behind, and in an instant he lost everything. His parents, his siblings, his home, his entire world gone. No warning, no explanation, just an empty house filled with memories he would never escape. While investigators tried to make sense of what happened, the community was left in shock. How could this happen? How could two parents fall so deeply into their beliefs that they would take the lives of their own children? The Stracks weren't violent people. They weren't criminals. To those who knew them, they were just another family. A family that loved their kids. A family that wanted to protect them. But from what? And at what cost? Authorities and psychologists examined the case, looking at the dangers of extreme beliefs. How paranoia, isolation, and fear can spiral into something unthinkable. The connection to Dan Lafferty only made the case more disturbing. A convicted killer, locked away for decades, yet still influencing the minds of those on the outside. His crimes had been driven by religious extremism, and now, decades later, his beliefs had led to more deaths, more innocent lives lost, more questions that could never be answered. For the surviving son, there was no way to understand it, no way to make sense of what his parents had done. And for everyone else, there was only one chilling realization. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from outside threats. It comes from the people we trust the most. Even after all the investigations, all the reports, and all the analysis, some questions may never be answered. Did the children know what was happening? Did they understand the choice their parents had made, or did they simply fall asleep, unaware they would never wake up? How much influence did Dan Lafferty truly have over the Stracks? Did his words push them toward this final decision, or was their fate already sealed long before? And the most painful question of all, could this tragedy have been prevented? The deaths of the Strack family serve as a grim reminder. Paranoia and isolation can be just as dangerous as any physical threat. Fear can consume people, and when it does, it spreads. Radical beliefs don't just affect the ones who hold them. They seep into families. They take root in children. They turn love into something unrecognizable. A mother and father convinced themselves they were saving their children. Instead, they took everything from them. And in the end, they left behind more questions than answers.